It was galling that the schemer I needed was restricted, but there are always other ways of finding information, and there are always people who know more than they are supposed to. So, after several minutes of racking my brain for a better option, I made my way to the Bale and Barley. The Bale was one of the more disreputable taverns this side of the river. Anchor's wasn't seedy in the strictest sense, it simply lacked pretension. It was clean without smelling of flowers and inexpensive without being tawdry. People visited Anchor's to eat, drink, listen to music, and occasionally have a friendly fight. The Bale was several rungs farther down the ladder. It was grubbier, music was not a priority, and the fights were usually only recreational for one of the people involved. Mind you, the Bale wasn't as bad as half the places in Tarbine, but it was the worst you were likely to find this close to the university. So despite being seedy, it had wooden floors and glass in the windows, and if you passed out drunk and woke up missing your purse, you could content yourself with the fact that nobody had knifed you and stolen your boots as well. As it was still early in the day, there were a bare handful of people scattered around the common room. I was glad to see Sleat sitting in the back. I hadn't actually met him, but I knew who he was. I'd heard stories. Sleat was one of the rare, indispensable people who have a knack of arranging things. From what I'd heard, he'd been a student on and off for the last 10 years. He was talking with a nervous-looking man at the moment, and I knew better than to interrupt. So I bought 2 mugs of short beer and made a pretense of drinking one while I waited. Sleat was handsome, dark-haired and dark-eyed. Though he didn't have the characteristic beard I expected, he was at least half Caledish. His body language screamed authority. He moved as if he were in control of everything around him. Which wouldn't have surprised me, actually. He could own the Bale for all I knew. People like Sleat are no strangers to money. Sleat and the anxious young man finally came to some sort of agreement. Sleat smiled warmly as they shook hands and clapped the man on the shoulder as he walked away. I waited for a moment, then made my way over to his table. As I came closer, I noticed there was a stretch of open floor between his table and the others in the common room. It wasn't much, just enough so eavesdropping would be difficult. Sleat looked up as I approached. "I was wondering if we could talk," I said. He made an expansive gesture to the empty chair. "This is a bit of a surprise," he said. "Why's that?" "I don't get a lot of clever folks paying me visits. I get desperate folks." He looked at the mugs. "Are those both for you?" "You can have either or both." I nodded at the one on the right. "But I've already had my mouth on that one." He looked at the mugs warily for a fraction of a second, then gave a wide, white smile and took the drink on the left. "From what I've heard, you're not the sort to poison a man." "You seem to know a lot about me," I said. His shrug was so casual I guessed he'd practiced it. "I know a lot about everyone," he said. "But I know more about you." "Why's that?" Sleat slouched forward, leaning on the table and speaking in a confidential tone. "Do you have any idea how boring your average student is? Half of them are rich tourists who don't care half a damn for their classes." He rolled his eyes and gestured as if throwing something over his shoulder. "The other half are bookish tits who've dreamed of this place so long they can hardly breathe once they're here. They walk on eggshells, meek as priests, scared lest the masters cast a disapproving eye in their direction." He sniffed disdainfully and leaned back in his seat. "Suffice to say, you're a breath of fresh air. Everyone says—" He stopped and gave his practiced shrug again. "Well, you know." "Actually, I don't," I admitted. "What do people say?" Sleat gave me a sharp, beautiful smile. "Ah, that's the problem, isn't it? Everyone knows a man's reputation except the man himself. For most men, this isn't a bother, but some of us labour over our reputations. I have built mine brick by brick. It is a useful tool." He gave me a sly look. "I expect you understand what I am talking about." I allowed myself a smile. "Perhaps." "What did they say about me, then? Tell me and I'll return the favour. Well, I said, you're good at finding things. You're discreet but expensive. He waved his hands, irritated. Vagaries! Details are the bones of the story. Give me bones. I thought. I heard you managed to sell several vials of Regimignal Narratum last term, after the fire in Kilvin's shop, where all of it was supposedly destroyed. Sleat nodded, his expression giving away nothing. I heard you arranged to get a message to Vienne's father in Emlyn despite the fact that there was a siege going on. Another nod. You got a young prostitute working in Buttons a set of documents proving she was a distant bloodline cousin of the Baronet Gamray, allowing her to marry a certain young gentleman with minimal fuss. Sleat smiled. I was proud of that one. When you were an Elir, I continued, you were suspended for 2 terms on charges of wrongful apprehension. 2 years later, you were fined and suspended again for misuse of university equipment in the Crucible. I've heard Jameson knows the sort of business you do, but he's paid to turn a blind eye. I don't believe the last one, by the way. Fair enough, he said easily. Neither do I. Despite your extensive activities, you've only been brought up against the Iron Law once, I continued. Transport of contraband substances, wasn't it? Sleat rolled his eyes. You know, the damnedest thing, I was actually innocent of that one. Heffron's boys paid off a constable to fake some evidence. The charges were withdrawn after only 2 days. He scowled. Not that the masters cared. All they gave a damn about was that I was out there besmirching the university's good name. His tone was bitter. My tuition tripled after that. I decided to push matters a bit. Several months ago you poisoned a young earl's daughter with venetacin and only gave her the antidote after she signed over the largest of the fiefdoms she stood to inherit. Then you staged it to look like she'd lost it playing a game of high-stakes faro. He raised an eyebrow at this. Do they say why? No, I said. I assume she tried to default on her debt to you. There's some truth to that, he said. Though it was a bit more complicated, and it wasn't venetacin. That would be extraordinarily reckless. He looked offended and brushed at his sleeve, plainly irritated. Anything else? I paused, trying to decide if I wanted to get confirmation about something I'd suspected for some time. Only that last term you put Ambrose Jackus in touch with a pair of men who have been known to kill people for money? Sleat's expression remained impassive, his body loose and relaxed, but I could see a slight tension in his shoulders. Very little escapes me when I'm watching closely. They say that, do they? I gave a shrug that put his to shame. My shrug was so nonchalant it would make a cat jealous. I'm a musician. I play 3 nights a span in a busy tavern. I hear all manner of things. I reached for my mug. And what have you heard of me? The same stories everyone else knows, of course. You convince the masters to admit you to the university, though you're just a pup, no offence. Then 2 days later, you shame Master Hemi in his own classroom and get away bird-free. Save for a whipping. Save for a whipping, he acknowledged, during which you couldn't be bothered to cry out or bleed, even a little. I wouldn't believe that if there weren't several hundred witnesses. We drew a decent crowd, I said. It was good weather for a whipping. I've heard some overly dramatic folk call you Quoth the Bloodless because of it, he said, though I'm guessing part of it comes from the fact that you're a demaroo, which means you're about as far from a blooded noble as a person can be. I smiled. A bit of both, I expect. He looked thoughtful. I've heard you and Master Elodine fought in Haven. Vast and terrible magics were unleashed, and in the end he won by throwing you through a stone wall, then off the roof of the building. Do they say what we fought over? I asked. All manner of things, he said dismissively. An insult, a misunderstanding. You tried to steal his magic, he tried to steal your woman, typical nonsense. Sleet rubbed at his face. Let me see. You play the lute, passing well, and are proud as a kicked cat. You're unmannerly, sharp-tongued, and show no respect for your betters, which is practically everyone given your lowly ravelled birth. I felt a flush of anger start in my face and sweep, hot and prickling down the entire length of my body. I am the best musician you will ever meet or see from a distance, I said with forced calm, and I am Edemaru to my bones. That means my blood is red, it means I breathe the free air and walk where my feet take me. I do not cringe and fawn like a dog at a man's title. That looks like pride to people who have spent their lives cultivating supple spines. Sleat gave a lazy smile, and I realized he'd been baiting me. You also have a temper, so I've heard. And there's a whole boatload of other assorted nonsense floating around you as well. You only sleep an hour each night. You have demon blood. You can talk to the dead. I leaned forward, curious. That wasn't one of the rumors I'd started. Really? Do I talk to spirits, or are they claiming I'm digging up bodies? I'm assuming spirits, he said. I haven't heard anyone mention grave robbing. I nodded. Anything else? Only that you were cornered in an alley last term by two men who killed people for money, and despite the fact that they had knives and caught you quite unaware, you blinded one and beat the other senseless, calling down fire and lightning like Tabor the Great. We looked at each other for a long moment. It was not a comfortable silence. Did you put Ambrose in touch with them? I asked at last. That, Sleat said frankly, is not a good question. It implies I discuss private dealings after the fact. He gave me a flat look, no hint of a smile anywhere near his mouth or eyes. Besides, would you trust me to answer honestly? I frowned. I can say, however, that because of those stories, nobody's much interested in taking that sort of job again, Sleat said conversationally. Not that there is much call for that sort of work around here to begin with. We're all terribly civilized. Not that you would know about it, even if it were going on. His smile came back. Exactly. He leaned forward. Enough chatter then. What is it you're looking for? I need a schema for a piece of artificing. He set his elbows on the table. And? It contains sigildry Kilvin restricts to those of Elthe rank and higher. Sleat nodded matter-of-factly. And how quickly do you need it? Hours? Days? I thought about Will and Sim staying up nights to watch over me. Sooner is better. Sleat looked thoughtful, his eyes unfocused. It's going to cost, and there's no guarantee I'll be able to produce it on an exact schedule. He focused in on me. Also, if you get caught, you'll be charged with wrongful apprehension at the very least. I nodded. And you know what the penalties are? For wrongful apprehension of the arcane not leading to injury of another, I recited, the offending student may be fined no more than 20 talents, whipped no more than 10 times, suspended from the arcanum, or expelled from the university. They fined me the full 20 talents and suspended me 2 terms, Sleat said grimly. And that was only some Raylar level alchemy. It will be worse with you if this is Elthe level stuff. How much? I asked. To get hold of it in a few days? He looked up at the ceiling for a moment. 30 talents. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach, but I kept my face composed. Is there any room to negotiate that? He gave his sharp smile again. His teeth were very white. I also deal in favors, he said, but a 30-talent favor is going to be a big one. He looked at me thoughtfully. We could perhaps work out something along those lines, but I feel obliged to mention that when I call a favor due, it's due. At that point, there isn't any negotiation. I nodded calmly to show him I understood, but I felt a cold knot forming in my gut. This was a bad idea. I knew it in my bones. Do you owe anyone else? Sleat asked. And don't lie to me, or I'll know. 6 talents, I said casually, due at the end of the term. He nodded. I'm guessing you didn't manage to get it off some moneylender. Did you go to Heffron? I shook my head. Devi. For the first time in our conversation, Sleat lost his composure. His charming smile fell away entirely. Devi. He pulled himself up in his chair, his body suddenly tense. No, I don't think we can come to an arrangement. If you had cash, it would be one thing. He shook his head. But no, if Devi already owns a piece of you. His reaction chilled me. Then I realized he was just angling for more money. What if I were to borrow money from you so I could settle my debt with her? Sleat shook his head, regaining a piece of his shattered nonchalance. That is the very definition of poaching, he said. Devi has an ongoing interest in you in investment. He took a drink and cleared his throat meaningfully. She does not look kindly on other folk interfering where she staked her claim. I raised an eyebrow. I guess I was taken in by your reputation, I said. Silly of me, really. His face creased into a frown. What do you mean by that? I waved my hands dismissively. Please give me credit for being at least half as clever as you've heard, I said. If you can't get what I want, just admit it. Don't waste my time by pricing things out of my reach or coming up with elaborate excuses. Sleat seemed unsure if he should be offended. What part of this seems elaborate to you? Come now, I said. You're willing to run against the laws of the university, risk the wrath of the masters, the constables, and the iron law of Artor, but a little slip of a girl makes your knees quivery. I sniffed and mimicked the gesture he'd made before, pretending to ball something up and throw it away over my shoulder. He looked at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. Yes, that's exactly the case, he said, wiping tears of genuine amusement from his eyes. Apparently, I was fooled by your reputation too. If you think Devi is a little slip of a girl, you aren't nearly as clever as I thought. Looking over my shoulder, Sleat nodded at someone I couldn't see and waved his hand dismissively. Go on with you, he said. I have business to do with rational people who know the true shape of the world. You're wasting my time. I felt myself prickling with irritation, but forced myself to keep it off my face. I also need a crossbow, I said. He shook his head. Oh, I've already told you, no loans or favours. I can offer goods in exchange. He looked at me skeptically. What sort of crossbow? Any sort, I said. It needn't be fancy, it just needs to work. 8 talents, he said. I gave him a hard look. Don't insult me, this is mundane contraband. I'll bet 10 to a penny you can have one in 2 hours. If you try to gouge me, I'll just go over the river and get one from Heffron. Get one from Heffron, and you'll have to carry it back from Imre, he said. Constable would love seeing that. I shrugged and began to get to my feet. 3 talents and 5, he said. It'll be used, mind you, and a stirrup, not a crank. I calculated in my head. Will you accept an ounce of silver and a spool of finely drawn gold wire? I asked, bringing them out from the pockets of my cloak. Sleet's dark eyes unfocused slightly as he did his own internal calculations. You drive a tight bargain. He picked up the spool of bright wire and the small ingot of silver. There's a rain barrel behind the Grimsome Tannery. The crossbow will be there in 15 minutes. He gave me an insulted look. 2 hours? You don't know anything about me at all.